Aloha! Thank you for joining us here at TruthMadeEasy.com as we continue with our Apologetics Made Easy video training course. The title for this video is Jesus Proves He is God. We are currently working our way through our 5 points here in our 5-point hand illustration, proving that Jesus is God. In the last video, we saw how the New Testament writers claimed that Jesus was God, and Jesus himself claimed he was God in 9 different ways. Now, claiming to be God is one thing. Proving it is quite another. In this video, we will see how Jesus actually proved he was God in 4 main ways. In our last video, we saw that Jesus claimed to be God in these 9 ways. By claiming to be the Messiah God, the Yahweh, Lord of the Old Testament, worthy of honor, do only God. He claimed to be the great I Am and the object of prayer like God. He also claimed to be equal in authority with God, worthy of worship, equal with God, and one with the Father. Now, when Jesus made these claims to be God, was he telling the truth? Well, when you get right down to it, either Jesus told the truth or he lied. Now, if Jesus was not God, and he knew it, he would be a bad man, a liar. If Jesus was not God, but he thought he was, he would be what? A madman, a lunatic. Lastly, if Jesus really was God, he would be the God-man or Lord. So which is he? Is Jesus Christ a liar? Is he a lunatic? Or is he Lord? Is he a bad man, a madman, or the God-man? Is Jesus Christ really God? Well, we know that the New Testament is true and reliable. We can believe what it tells us. And we've already seen in our last video that Jesus really did claim to be God. But did he prove it? Anyone can claim to be God. That's easy. Proving you're God, well, that's a different matter. Well, as we're going to see in this video, there is overwhelming evidence that proves, beyond a reasonable doubt, that Jesus really is the God he claimed to be. Jesus' claim to be God were supported by his predicting and accomplishing his own resurrection from the dead, his fulfilling of Old Testament prophecies, living a sinless life, and by performing supernatural miracles. Let's now begin looking at the evidence found in the historically reliable New Testament. In chapter 2 of the Gospel of John, we read about Jesus clearing the temple and saying to the money changers, "How dare you turn my Father's house into a market?" Well, the Jews challenge him, "What miraculous sign can you show us to prove your authority to do all this?" Jesus responds by saying, "Destroy this temple, and I will raise it again in 3 days." They replied, "It has taken 46 years to build this temple, and are you going to raise it in 3 days?" But the temple he had spoken of was his body. John 2:19-21. Jesus was saying here, "Destroy this temple, destroy my body, and in 3 days I will raise this temple, my body, from the dead." He communicated a similar message regarding his future resurrection from the dead in Matthew chapter 12. "For as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of a huge fish, so the Son of Man will be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth." Jesus also predicted exact details of his betrayal and the events surrounding his crucifixion and death. At the Last Supper, he identifies the one who was to betray him, Judas Iscariot, by saying, "He who shared my bread has turned against me." Who was it that betrayed Jesus to the Jewish leaders that very night? Judas Iscariot. We read, "Now the betrayer, Judas, had arranged a signal with them. 'The one I kiss is the man. Arrest him and lead him away under guard.' Going at once to Jesus, Judas said, 'Rabbi,' and kissed him. The men seized Jesus and arrested him." Also on that same night that Jesus was betrayed and taken by the Jews, Jesus told his disciple Peter in advance that before the night was over, he, Peter, would deny Jesus 3 times. We read here, "Before the rooster crows twice, you yourself, Peter, will disown me 3 times." Mark 14:30-31. And that's exactly what happened. We read in Mark 14 that later that same night, he, Peter, began to call down curses, and he swore to them, "I don't know this man you're talking about." Immediately, the rooster crowed the second time. Then Peter remembered the word Jesus had spoken to him. Before the rooster crows twice, you will disown me 3 times. And he broke down and wept. Mark 14:71 and 72. Then in Mark chapter 10, Jesus gives exact details surrounding his death before it even happens. He tells his disciples what the Jewish leaders are going to do to him, how they will take him, condemn him, and hand him over to the Romans. Beginning in Mark 10:33, we read, "They will condemn him to death and will hand him over to the Gentiles, who will mock him and spit on him, flog him, and kill him." And what did they do to Jesus? They mocked him, flogged him, and killed him, just as Jesus predicted. He then made the amazing claim at the tail end of that same passage. We read in Mark 10:34, 3 days later, he will rise. Here's a picture of the empty tomb in Jerusalem. Now, what person do you know in all of history, other than Jesus, who predicted the exact details of his death before it happened, and then predicted how many days later he would come back from the dead? Nobody, that's who. But Jesus did. Jesus, the God-man, predicted and accomplished his own resurrection from the dead. We read this account in Luke 24 of the women visiting the tomb where Jesus was buried on that very first Easter morning. They found the stone rolled away from the tomb, but when they entered, they did not find the body of the Lord Jesus. While they were wondering about this, suddenly 2 men in clothes that gleamed like lightning stood beside them. In their fright, the women bowed down with their faces to the ground. But the men said to them, "Why do you look for the living among the dead? He is not here. He has risen. Remember how he told you, while he was still with you in Galilee, that the Son of Man must be delivered into the hands of sinful men, be crucified, and on the 3rd day be raised again?" Then they remembered his words. Luke 24, 2-8. Think about that for a moment. Jesus, the God-man, had defeated death. This is wonderful news for all Christians, because Jesus tells us in John 11:25, "I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live, even though they die." Not only did Jesus rise from the dead, but he promises that all who follow him will be resurrected to new life after they die. Now, after Jesus rose from the dead, he made appearances to different people at different times. In the Gospel of John, we read of one account where Jesus appeared to his disciples, but one of them, named Thomas, was not with him at the time. So the other disciples told him, "We have seen the Lord." But he said to them, "Unless I see the nail marks in his hands, and put my finger where the nails were, and put my hand into his side, I will not believe." A week later, his disciples were in the house again, and Thomas was with them. Though the doors were locked, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." John 20:25-26. We looked at this event in our last video and we saw how Jesus accepted worship from Thomas. In this same passage, Jesus tells Thomas to examine his wounds from the crucifixion where they had used nails and where they had pierced his side with a spear. "Put your fingers here. See my hands," Jesus says to Thomas. "Reach out your hand and put it into my side." To which Thomas replies, "My Lord and my God." The Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians 15 tells of others who saw Jesus alive after he arose from the dead. Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the 3rd day according to the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas and then to the 12. After that he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers and sisters at the same time, most of whom are still living, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles, and last of all he appeared to me also, as to one abnormally born. Each of these were eyewitnesses of Christ's resurrection. And when Paul wrote this, he says that most of them were still alive. Since there were 500 witnesses, and most of them were alive, that would mean that at a minimum, 251 witnesses were still alive at the time of this writing. In his own gospel, Luke includes these words about another of Jesus' post-resurrection appearances when he appeared to his disciples. Jesus is speaking here, "Look at my hands and my feet. It is I myself. Touch me and see. A ghost does not have flesh and bones as you see I have." When he had said this, he showed them his hands and feet. And while they still did not believe it, because of joy and amazement, he asked them, "Do you have anything here to eat?" They gave him a piece of broiled fish, and he took it and ate it in their presence. Luke 24:39-43. Now we know that dead men don't talk, and dead men don't eat, but Jesus did both. Now what have we learned here about Christ's resurrection? Well, we've already proved that the New Testament is historically reliable in prior videos. We can believe what it tells us. Since the reliable and trustworthy New Testament tells us that Jesus rose from the dead and that he appeared to his disciples and others, we can believe these resurrection events to be true. Now, Jesus' resurrection is proof enough that he was the Son of God, but there's more. In addition to predicting and accomplishing his own resurrection from the dead, Jesus' claims to be God were supported by fulfilling Old Testament prophecies. Now here again is a slide of the great Isaiah scroll, which we looked at earlier in our study of the New Testament. This scroll, as we learned, contains all 66 chapters of Isaiah, including Isaiah 53, which, as Norman Geisler and Frank Turek point out, contains perhaps the clearest and most complete prophecy about the coming Messiah. Here's a portion of chapter 53 written 100 years, that's right, a full century before Christ was born. We read, "He was despised and rejected by mankind, a man of suffering and familiar with pain. Like one from whom people hide their faces, he was despised, and we held him in low esteem. Surely he took up our pain and bore our suffering. Yet we considered him punished by God, stricken by him, and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we are healed. We all like sheep have gone astray, each of us have turned to our own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all." Continuing, "He was oppressed and afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before its shearers is silent, so he did not open his mouth. By oppression and judgment he was taken away. Yet who of his generation protested? For he was cut off from the land of the living. For the transgression of my people he was punished." Isaiah 53, 3-8. And then in Psalm 22, we find another Old Testament messianic psalm, which is also prophetic in nature, describing Jesus' horrible ordeal on the cross. Remember again, this was written before Jesus was born. "But I am a worm and not a man, scorned by everyone, despised by the people. All who see me mock me. They hurl insults, shaking their heads. He trusts in the Lord, they say. Let the Lord rescue him. Let him deliver him, since he delights in him." Psalm 22, 6-8. Continuing a few verses down, beginning at verse 14 of Psalm 22, speaking of Christ, "I am poured out like water, and all my bones are out of joint. My heart has turned to wax. It has melted within me. My mouth is dried up like a potsherd, and my tongue sticks to the roof of my mouth. You lay me in the dust of death. Dogs surround me. A pack of villains encircles me. They pierce my hands and my feet. All my bones are on display. People stare and gloat over me. They divide my clothes among them and cast lots for my garment." Psalm 22, 14-18. Now we have some other Old Testament prophecies pertaining to Jesus to talk about, but before we do that, let's take a quick look at a timeline to give you a better idea of the dating of the Old Testament as it relates to the birth and death of Christ. There on the right we have the manger scene and the cross at AD 33. On the left here we have the Old Testament writings, which date back from about 165 to 400 BC. These Old Testament writings contain prophecies recorded hundreds of years before Christ's birth. We're now going to look at just 9 specific Old Testament prophecies. Understand that these prophecies foretold the future coming of the Messiah. Now, as we go through them, ask yourself, what man from all of history has even come close to fulfilling these 9 next prophecies, okay? We'll begin with the first, found in Genesis 3:15, which tells us that the Messiah would be born of a woman. 2, that he would be a descendant of Abraham, according to Genesis 12:3 and 7. He would be from the tribe of Judah, Genesis 49:10. He would be from the line of David, the king, Jeremiah 23:5-6 and Jeremiah 33:15. 5, he would be both God and man, Isaiah 9:6. That he would be born of a virgin in a specific town, the town of Bethlehem. We read that in Luke 1:31 and in Isaiah 7:14 and Micah 5:2. Number 7, that the Messiah would be preceded by a messenger and would visit the temple. That's in Mark 1:3 and Malachi 3:1. Number 8, that he would die in 33 AD. Now, we're not going to get into the math here, but this passage in Daniel 9 speaks of the future death of Christ that was to occur 483 years after the decree of the Persian ruler Artaxerxes to rebuild the Jewish temple. The 483 years are calculated using the 62 7-year periods based on the Jewish calendar. And lastly, number 9, the Messiah will rise from the dead. Isaiah 53:11. Again, as I commented earlier, what man from all of history was born of a woman, was a descendant of Abraham, was from the tribe of Judah, the line of David, was both God and man, born of a virgin, preceded by a messenger, died in AD 33, and rose from the dead? The answer is clear. Only one man fulfilled all these prophecies, Jesus Christ, the God-man. And we're not done. In addition to predicting and accomplishing his own resurrection and fulfilling Old Testament prophecy, Jesus' claim to be God are supported by his living a sinless life. Let me ask you something. Have you ever met a perfect, sinless person? A person doesn't need to spend more than a few days with you or I to know that we're not perfect people, right? Yet those who lived with Jesus, who were by his side day and night, who observed his every move and heard him speak, claimed that he was perfect and sinless. Let's look at a few of the verses that talk about Christ being sinless. In John chapter 8, Jesus challenges the Jews of his day. Can any of you prove me guilty of sin? If I am telling the truth, why don't you believe me? The Apostle Peter, in talking of Jesus, comments in 1 Peter 1:19 that Christ was a lamb without blemish or defect, and then adds a chapter later, he committed no sin, and no deceit was found in his mouth. The Apostle John tells us in 1 John 3:5, in him, speaking of Christ, in him is no sin. And in Hebrews we read, for we do not have a high priest who is unable to empathize with our weaknesses, but we have one who has been tempted in every way, just as we are, yet he did not sin. Hebrews 4:15. In Mark 14:55, we see that even his enemies couldn't find fault with Jesus. The chief priests and the whole Sanhedrin were looking for evidence against Jesus so they could put him to death, but they did not find any. Mark 14:55. And let's not forget the words of Pontius Pilate, who ultimately condemned Jesus to his death on the cross. I have found in him no grounds for the death penalty. Therefore I will have him punished and then release him. Well, so far we have seen that Jesus' claims to be God have been supported by his resurrection, fulfilled prophecies, and by living a sinless life. We'll now look at the last line of evidence, his performing supernatural miracles. You'll recall from our earlier video on miracles that a miracle is by definition a supernatural thing, a rare event, something that doesn't occur naturally by natural laws. That's why it's called supernatural. It's beyond nature and beyond natural laws. Well, Jesus performed at least 35 supernatural miracles in the New Testament. Let's take a look at just a few of them now. Well known to most is Jesus performing the miracle of feeding 5,000 plus people with just 5 loaves of bread and 2 fishes. Let's read of that account. Here is a boy with 5 barley loaves and 2 small fish. but how far will they go among so many?" Jesus said, "Have the people sit down." There was plenty of grass in that place, and they sat down. About 5,000 men were there. Jesus then took the loaves, gave thanks, and distributed to those who were seated as much as they wanted. He did the same with the fish. When they had all had enough to eat, he said to his disciples, "Gather the pieces that are left over. Let nothing be wasted." So they gathered them and filled 12 baskets with the pieces of the 5 barley loaves left over by those who had eaten. John 6, 9-13. In the Gospel of Mark, Jesus raises a 12-year-old girl from the dead. We read, "After he put them all out, he took the child's father and mother and the disciples who were with him, and went in where the child was. He took her by the hand and said unto her, Talitha cumi, which means, Little girl, I say to you, get up. Immediately the girl stood up and began to walk around. She was 12 years old. At this they were completely astonished." Mark 5, 41 and 42. And we read of another familiar miracle in John chapter 11, Jesus raising Lazarus, who had already been dead for 4 days. Jesus brought back Lazarus from the dead with a simple command. He just spoke it. We read, Jesus called in a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out." John 11:43. The writer of the book of Hebrews tells of the signs, wonders, and various miracles performed by Jesus and his followers. We read, "How shall we escape if we ignore so great a salvation? This salvation, which was first announced by the Lord, was confirmed to us by those who heard him. God also testified to it by signs, wonders, and various miracles, and by gifts of the Holy Spirit distributed according to his will." Hebrews 2, 3 and 4. In the book of Acts, Peter, an eyewitness himself of many New Testament miracles, tells the people that God did miracles through Jesus. Fellow Israelites, listen to this. Jesus of Nazareth was a man accredited by God to you by miracles, wonders, and signs, which God did among you through him, as you yourselves know. Acts 2:22. Well, Jesus turned water into wine at a marriage in Galilee. We're familiar with that one. He walked on water in John chapter 6. We read elsewhere in Mark chapter 5 that he healed a demoniac. And then there was the miraculous catch of fish in John chapter 21. And when he departed from his disciples in Acts chapter 1, he performed the miracle of ascending bodily from the earth into the sky. Well, as we wrap up this video, what can we conclude? Well, I think we can conclude that from each of these things, Jesus predicting and accomplishing his own resurrection from the dead, his fulfilling Old Testament prophecies, living a sinless life, and performing supernatural miracles, I believe we can conclude, beyond a reasonable doubt, Jesus has proved to be the God he claimed to be. And yet, as convincing as all these proofs are, still many object today to Jesus being God. Well, we're going to talk about that in our next video, Common Objections to Jesus being God and the Trinity. We'll see how we can answer many common objections to the deity of Christ with a proper understanding of the Trinity.